I'm Chris Skowroński from Berlin Practical Philosophy International Forum. I co-organize an international conference on Pragmatist Kant in Berlin at Finland Institute, July 2017. I have Sarin Marchetti, who is a professor at Sapienza University in Rome, who is one of the speakers, one of the participants of the conference of this project. Sarin, welcome.
Welcome. Thanks, and thanks for the lovely invitation, Chris.
I know Sarin because we cooperate on the occasion of European Journal of Pragmatist American Philosophy as well. So we are dealing with pragmatism and other issues for a pretty long time. So I'm glad you're one of the speakers here.
Well, I'm glad you invited me, and I'm really happy to be part of this wonderful project.
Could you tell us something about the idea of your project, of your contribution? What's the idea?
Thanks. Well, as you said, I've been working in the area of pragmatism for quite some time, but I'm not a Kant scholar, so I wouldn't call myself a Kant scholar. But still, I've been doing some bits and pieces of work on Kant because I think that there are connections between pragmatism and Kantian philosophy. But the particular way in this topic, that is Kantian pragmatism and Kant as a pragmatist, for me, really came up because of my interest in moral philosophy, in ethics and moral philosophy. So like you, I work on pragmatist moral philosophy. And usually when you do pragmatist moral philosophy, Kant is one of the enemies, because Kant is a moral theoretician who held a particularly strong view of moral theory and version of moral theory. And pragmatists, and especially James, William James, who is my pragmatist philosopher of reference, was pretty much against everything that Kant said. But at the same time, there are aspects of Kant's philosophy overall, and in particular of Kant's moral philosophy, which are very keen to what James and pragmatism and classical pragmatism were saying. So basically, by reading this literature, I found myself reading Kant's Pragmatic Anthropology, that is his 1798 book on anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. And I recognized that there are a lot of cross-interest and almost cross-references between Kant's and William James' Principle of Psychology, which has been written 100 years later in 1890. So I started to read the two texts together, and I suddenly realized that a certain way into Kant, and a certain, we might call Kant overall, so not the Kant of the official Kant of the critique, but the Kant of the history of the anthropology, had something to say to the pragmatist. And then in Berlin, in particular, I will be presenting a paper on the connections between these two texts in particular, so the anthropology from a pragmatic point of view by Kant and the Principle of Psychology by James. Now, the way I will be presenting this goes like this. The usual picture of Kant, as I was saying, is, which I think also is the right picture of Kant, is of a moral philosopher who had very strong moral views and who built his own moral theory, which was, a version of deontology, but also with strong influences by, the ancient world of virtue. So he's also a virtue theorist. So Kant could be read as a deontologician, but also as a virtue theorist. And that's the official story of Kant. And as I was saying, pragmatism, moral philosophy in general, and James in particular, were very critical of these big projects, foundational project in moral philosophy. What happens is that Kant, alongside his most notable moral work, that is the three critiques, and in particular the second critique, and the groundwork and the metaphysics of customs, what he did, the metaphysics of morals, what he did is he taught for some 25 years in a row, from like 1772 up to his retirement, courses on history, on religion, and on anthropology. And his courses on anthropology are very relevant because he gives us, Kant, a slightly different picture of the moral life. So in the Anthropology, which is no is called nothing short of the pragmatic anthropology, he gives us a picture of human being from the point of view of what they make of themselves and what they're able to do of themselves. And I find this project very much in line with what James was doing 100 years later in his Principle of Psychology, in which he didn't give us, obviously, any moral theory in a full-fledged terms. Not only that, but also he didn't give us a merely descriptive presentation of our moral life or of our, in particular, life of the mind. What he did, he wrote these 2 thick volumes on psychology, but that was a text in which he delved deep into the description of what we might do with ourselves and of ourselves. So I think that there is this transformative register at work, both in Kant and in James. And I think this is a nice way to inquiry the somewhat hidden connection between pragmatism on one hand and Kantian philosophy on the other hand. So that's a very basic general picture behind my talk. And the way it actually relates to my wider interest in philosophy, moral philosophy, is to answer the very question, what do we do as moral philosopher when we engage in moral philosophy? And one question is that, as said, we build moral theories which describe the very phenomenon of morality, and they prescribe a particular picture of the moral life that they want to implement. And on the other hand, according to this other Kant and according to the pragmatist, when you do moral philosophy, you do something very different. That is that you describe your moral life, but from the point of view of what you yourself or human beings more generally do with their own moral life. And you do this in a variety of ways. And we can, if you like, we can go into the details of this. But basically, the idea is that in both orders, and hence in pragmatism and in Kantian philosophy, and we can see this in post-Kantian philosophy as well, in Hegel as well, for example, which I'm also not a scholar of. But we can see this idea that ethics has to do with self-transformation and not with the implementation of principles, and not with a metaphysical description of human beings. So that's a very general theme behind my current research.
Maybe a question for our non-philosophical audiences, because they may see us. How would you say, because you are saying that it's a theoretical issue, creating theories, what is its practical implementation or possible implementation? How would you describe it? Is it just a theoretical issue, or it can be converted into some kind of practical approach?
Well, thanks for the question. Well, I would put it this way. The standard, I would say, contemporary, modern and contemporary picture of what philosophers and moral philosophers do in particular is to take a look at, for example, to keep talking about the moral case, take a look at the moral life as we ordinarily live it. And then do something like taking a snapshot of the moral life and say, okay, human beings are made of certain, for example, sentiments, certain possibilities to be rationals, or certain features. They have certain features. They have virtues, they have vices, they make promises, they don't fulfill promises. And so they take a snapshot, and they think that this is what anthropology should be doing, some kind of anthropology or sociology or just descriptive psychology. So we take a snapshot at how human beings behave in the world and behave, with themselves. So what kind of person they are. And then they say, okay, we take this snapshot, and this snapshot should be as general as we might get. And as we can, and then we handle this snapshot to moral philosophers who study this snapshot and say, okay, this is the kind of behavior that we want to implement, and this is the kind of behavior that we want to forbid. And we do this, we stress certain features of human beings, certain virtues, for example, or certain vices, from the point of view of a theory which is external to the kind of picture that we took. So there is some kind of like model, a moral model. And then philosopher, in a, what you were calling theoretical philosopher, what they do, even in the practical case, they work on the details of this model. Now, the kind of picture that Kant is suggesting us in the Anthropology, and that James is suggesting in the Principle of Psychology and elsewhere, is a completely different picture. So, for example, take the case of a certain virtue, or even of not of a virtue, but of a certain feature of human beings, such as memory. So we don't ask from this Kantian anthropological point of view and pragmatist point of view, what is memory and how does memory work? And then we try to, take these bits of information and put it in our moral system, according to which, for example, we should remember that we made promises in the past, and so on. What they say is that we don't ask what memory is and how does it function. This is something that we call, that we ask to other kind of figures, such as psychologists. What we ask is what we as human beings do with our memory. So, for example, how do we trust our memory? Do we trust it at all? How do we train our memory? And for example, in terms of promises, in conditions of promises, how do we understand the very act of remembering a past act or a past promise? So once you do that, you start to realize as a layperson that your moral life is really up to you, and there is no moral philosopher who can point you to the way and say, okay, so these features of yours should be praised or should not be praised according to this external model that works, that has been worked out by a philosopher. But the moral philosopher, or the philosopher overall, says to you, well, you should really handle your life the best way you can. And what we can do is to encourage you to deepen and to interrogate your own understanding of, for example, in this case, memory. That is, and you do this by pointing out what you do when you, for example, use memory in a certain situation. So the practicality of the whole story, of the whole business, is that you should be able, or you should be encouraged, at least that's the challenge, to work out yourself the concepts and the language you use to account for yourself. So as philosophers, we know, and we always tell our students and ourselves, that concepts and words and language is something that we inherit from the past, and we inherit from our community, from people around us, but we hardly question it, and we hardly question the personal bent and the personal feature of the way we use language, and for example, the way we conceptualize about promises. And so a pragmatist, Kantian, in this sense, anthropological pragmatist approach encourages you to deepen your own understanding of what your words mean, or what your language does in practice. So while you're doing something, you need to be able, at least, again, that's the challenge, to revise your own concepts, your own language, in order to have a better grasp of what you're doing. Not only what your other people are thinking, or what other people have been thinking for the past 2,000 years, or what you yourself, in your own situation, in your own community, are doing with yourself.
Okay, thank you. In your project, I think you focus predominantly on two disciplines, anthropology and ethics. I don't know if we have clear borderline between these two. Could you clarify?
Well, that's a very hard question. So one of the goals of my overall research is, as said, to reshape ethics the way philosophers and lay people understand it and understood it. And this goes for anthropology as well. Obviously, anthropology is a discipline in itself. There's cultural anthropology, social anthropology, and all sorts of anthropological studies. And philosophy, in a way, and moral philosophy in particular, is sometimes very close to these studies, but also wants to distinguish itself from these studies, and not only for curricular reasons and for academic reasons, but also because the kind of use that we philosophers and lay people, as encouraged by us philosophers, should be doing is quite different from the study study that the professional anthropologist would do. And so to go back to your question, I think that on the one hand, we should reshape ethics in the direction of its transcendentalization. So ethics should be transcendentalized in the sense that ethics is not something that can be handled down to us from somewhere else, from the above, by the moral theorists. And at the same time, anthropology is what we do when we go see how people behave, what people make of themselves, and in particular how they how they understand their own self-doing. In this way, it's the way I use anthropology, and in the way in which Kant uses anthropology, and in the way also James. Anthropology was not a big name for James. He would simply talking about psychology. And I know that obviously there's a big topic about the relationship between the two. But the way James understood it, his own psychology amounted to the description of what human beings in the most diverse situations ended up doing with themselves. So there is this attitude of like look and see what other people are doing with themselves. How do they describe what they're doing? So anthropology has to do with all things related to the way in which people account for themselves in practice.
It's very interesting, especially that you seem to suggest that your interest is, while thinking about human beings, that is not really a description of who they are, not really the I would say, asking question whom they should be, but rather you are saying whom we human beings might be. For me, it's a kind of political issue, because when you are saying we might be this or that, well, our history shows us that we can be everything. But could you define this last piece of your interest, that human beings can be? I mean, your interest is in what human beings can become or might be, but are you thinking about some kind of, I don't know, internal or external directions or limits or regulations or pressure, for example, social pressures, or these are anthropological or ethical only?
Okay, that's another huge question. So I would answer like this. The short answer to this would be, a short answer would be that my interest in this anthropological look at human beings, this ethical/anthropological look at human beings as beings who might do things with themselves, is motivated by the unsatisfaction with the long-term and actually, which is still with us, picture of the distinction between the factual on the one hand and the normative on the other hand. So I'll try to keep this simple, but the gist of it is that we usually think, not only philosophically, but also in our lay lives and our ordinary lives, that one thing is to describe something. So one thing is to account for what there is. And in case of anthropology or psychology, this would amount to the description of what human beings are, as you said. On the other hand, ethics people think, usually people think, and philosophers thought, that has to do with normative notions, such as what should be. So what should be thought, what should be done, what should be judged, and so on. And so there is this kind of gap between the descriptive component of thinking and the prescriptive or the normative component of thinking. And I think that we can see in Kant and in James, read in the way I try to read them, a debunking of this very dichotomy and dichotomical thinking. And James and Kant are saying, well, there is some kind of ethical anthropological gaze of human beings from the point of view of what they might do with themselves, which is at once descriptive because we're taking a look at what's going on, but also prescriptive, normative and also prescriptive at times, because what we do with ourselves and our deeds and our thoughts as consequences, they all have consequences on the other world and onto ourselves. And the point is that you can really tell the descriptive part from the normative part. And so this is the more technical answer and short answer. Now, to relate this with things of wider interest for the public, is that, of course, this kind of outlook was motivated, and Kant said this as well, and obviously James said this, and figures who work in the wake of Kant, James, and in the 20th century say this, that the most dangerous thing that there is in our historical present is to, for example, believe things out of authority and just do things out of sheer habit, for example. And this kind of movement of try to investigate what we do with our language, words, concept is a way into the critical problematization of what we became by and are constantly becoming by using certain words and using certain concepts. So the whole purpose of investigating the moral life from the point of view of what really can I do with and of myself aims at destabilizing and in a way making us uncomfortable with the words we have been using and the language we have been using and the concept that we have been using, and the words, concept, and language that have been played against us by society. So it is a political stance, but in this particular case, the political has a deep social, obviously, but ethical and anthropological grounding, because it has to do with the way in which we face the world, in which we are transformed by facing the world in a certain way. And the whole purpose of philosophy, spin this way, is to realize how we are fully entrenched with ways of speaking, talking, thinking. And the whole purpose of doing philosophy is to open up possibilities for us to behave differently, to think differently, and at bottom, to survey critically the thought and the acts and the judgments that we thought were central to our own self-description. And the whole purpose of this in Kant, for example, or in James, or later on in other pragmatist thinkers, is to try to think otherwise by being otherwise. You can only think otherwise if you are otherwise and if you behave otherwise. And in order to do that, you have to question yourself as some kind of historical happening. And that's, if I might add, that's the other, actually, to go back to the slightly more technical explanation of this. This goes back to Kant's text, because as I was saying it earlier, in his most well-known moral text, Kant made this distinction between what human beings do when they follow their own instincts and the moral law, which is something which is outside. It's kind of outside every human being, but also inside some kind of realm of reason to which we partake by being able to grasp the moral law. And he has a whole fascinating story about how you do that. And you might want to criticize that or not, but that's the basic picture. And in this text, in the anthropology text, what he does, and this very movement has been mirrored by James, is to show how this possibility to grasp principles, for example, is actually a possibility, is something that we can do, or something that we might fail to do. So pragmatic anthropology in this sense explores all those contexts in which you might fail to live up to a certain standard, or you might fail to understand the kind of practice you are into. So the practice of moral judgment that works in certain ways. So in a way, this moral anthropological point of view is a feature of the larger project of moral theory, because it gives you an insight about how moral theory at rock bottom is a practice itself. So you can learn, you can unlearn, you can learn differently how to judge, even according to that famous model or system that we spoke about earlier. So, and in this sense, just to finish up this answer, the pragmatist said, James, but also Richard Rorty more recently, that principles, laws, and norms really are instruments or tools for us to be used. But pay attention, they are rules for us to be used to remake ourselves. So there's, for this, at least according to a certain reading of pragmatism and a certain reading of Kant's work on anthropology, you should be using theories and even entire moral philosophies, entire moral systems to change who you think you are. And that's the transformative register that I'm very much interested into.
You are partially answering my next and final question about future developments. Would you like to add something or sum something up as far as this future development is concerned?
Well, I see two kinds of possible paths that this kind of approach can take. Again, one is more internal to philosophy and more internal to the way we reach out to students in the first place, but also to the ordinary life in general, and is to think that moral philosophy itself is some kind of meta tool to redo ourselves, and to redo ourselves also as thinkers. So when we think, and not only in philosophy classrooms, but like like on the streets and in any kind of situations. So we do not, we seldom think that what we are doing has deep philosophical and political consequences. And the one kind of consequence of this whole approach would be to bring in this kind of questioning, this which I kind of only sketched, this kind of deep questioning of one's historical present, and bring it into one's profession. For example, in the medical profession, this is most important. So, for example, when doctors are healing patients, up to which point should they keep going, and what kind of reflection should they be developing, and which kind of questions should they ask themselves and their patients in terms of, for example, how far should they go in implementing a certain medication. And so that's something that obviously it's everywhere, but in the medical profession, but in all sorts of professions. For example, take filmmakers who could be more aware and critical of their own present and try to convey this in their own works. So that's one side of it. The other side, I would say that it just gives someone, say, what they usually call the learned public, something to think about. That is, often we think that by reading philosophical books, and especially ethical books, we become better persons. And this whole idea of practicing ethics as some kind of, engaged anthropological study has to do with questioning the idea according to which, by reading, for example, philosophical books or going to philosophical seminars, you become a better person because you are told the answer to a certain problem, or you are like pointed in a certain direction. So you have a certain trouble, there's a certain trouble, a certain fact troubling you, there's a certain trouble in your life, there's a certain questioning that it's really around your head all day long. And then you go to philosophy seminars, so you buy James' Principle of Psychology or Kant Anthropology to find an answer to that. Well, if my reading is right, then you should turn to this literature and to these philosophy seminars or philosophy festivals, just to be aware that there are many more ways to ask your own question and to deepen what you mean by the words you use, even in phrasing that very question. So I know this might sound a bit vague, but I think that the open-endedness of philosophy is a central feature to it. So there are no really answers according to this way of understanding and practicing philosophy, but there are better and better ways of understanding what your questions are. So I know that this might be of interest for the non-specialists, and more often than not, this is what attracts the people, students in the first place, that they will be able to rethink what they think and rephrase the ways in which they have a certain concern, or for example, they would like to perform a certain line of activity. So I would say this could be actually a nice way to start thinking differently what philosophy and moral philosophy overall can do for us.
Sarin Marchetti, thank you for your interesting comments and for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I'm Skowroński from Berlin Practical Philosophy International Forum.